And I have already communicated with Mark, and to say to Mark, thanks for, he did a great job last week. I looked at the tape, and it is, the boy is getting better. And I called him and I said, boy, you getting better. And it was just great I looked at the sermon, and he's laying down all on the floor and having a good time. And do you want to get well? And it was just really, really great. And we'll always have Mark. Mark just is in love with this place. He really is. I don't know what you all did to Mark, but he just is addicted to this place. And so it's just a joy. The question that we are dealing with today, Ariana read in the scripture. The question we are dealing with is the question that Jesus asked of Peter. Do you see this woman? That's the question. Do you see this woman? That's the question. A very interesting story. And it is the story of the woman of the Pharisees who invited Jesus to a feast. And they invited Jesus to the feast, and Jesus is there, and they are all sitting down enjoying. And sitting down is really an inappropriate word to use, because they never sat down to eat. And that's not the way. They really, as Mark was last week, they really lay prostrate to eat. They would lay down on their left, and that's the way they would meet in a room, and there would be a big bowl of food in the middle, and all of them would lay down on their left side and put their head on their left hand, and they would eat with their right hand, and their feet will be, they would just lay down kinda and reach for the food. So right around you would see, when you walk in the room, all you would see is a whole bunch of feet. You know how they do it, Barbara. And here they are. And the Pharisees who invited Jesus, there they are, and Jesus is there eating and conversing and talking. And there is this woman of ill repute. Here is a prostitute that happens to come in the room. And when she comes into the room, she sees Jesus. And she comes over to Jesus. And as she is coming to Jesus, all the Pharisees in the room are saying, oh my God. She's not. And she eases her way over to where Jesus is. And as she eases her way over to where Jesus' legs are stretched out and his feet are there, and she reaches down into her bag, and she takes out some precious ointment, and she begins to massage the feet of Jesus. She is massaging the feet of Jesus with this ointment, this very expensive ointment. And as she is massaging the feet of Jesus, all the Pharisees are saying, he ain't no prophet, because if he were a prophet, he would know that she's a prostitute. And here she is, playing with his feet, massaging his feet. And she began to cry as she's massaging his feet, and the tears are rolling down onto the feet of Jesus. And she takes her hair and she wipes the feet of Jesus. And everybody is saying, no, Master, don't do that. She is a prostitute. And in the midst of that, Jesus has a conversation with Peter. And Jesus says, Peter, I thought by now you would get it. But you don't. And he says to all of them, there are two people that owed someone a whole bunch of money. They owed the bank a whole lot of money. One of them owed $500 and one of them owed $1,000. And the banker decided to forgive both of them. And when the banker forgave both of them, they both of them said, thank you very much. And they leave. And Jesus' question was, which one of them ought to be more grateful? And Peter says, I guess it's the one who owed $1,000. That's when Jesus looked, and Jesus says, Peter, do you see this woman? What a question. It's like the question last week. It's a dumb question. I would have said to Jesus, if I'm sick and Jesus comes to me and asks me, do you want to get well? I'd say, what do you think I'm here for? My good looks? Do you want to get well? No, watch your mouth, Barbara. Watch your mouth. Watch your mouth. Do you want to get well? Do you want to get well? No, to me, it's like, that's why I'm here. That's why I'm here. You see, everybody around is ill. That's why I'm here. I'm here to get well. Well, Jesus says to Peter, Peter, do you see that woman? And Peter must have wanted to say, come on. My question is, does Peter have a sight problem? Does Peter have a problem seeing? That Jesus would say, Peter, do you see that woman? I would say, yeah, Peter. Jesus, come on. I would, Reverend Talbot, I would think, I may be wrong, but I would think that Peter was with Jesus when the leper was brought to Jesus. When the leper said to Jesus, you can heal me if you really want to. And what a great healing that was. I want to believe that Peter was with Jesus when that took place. I don't think Peter had a seeing problem. I believe that Peter was with Jesus when there were 4 guys who brought a paraplegic to Jesus, looking for Jesus. And when they brought him to the house, they realized that they couldn't get into the house. They climbed on top of the house, took the roof off, and brought this guy right down smack in the middle where Peter was right there. I don't think Peter had a seeing problem because Peter was there. Not to see a healing because Jesus didn't heal. Then all Jesus looked and he says to the guy, my gosh, you have friends with all this great faith. Your sins are forgiven you. I believe that Peter was with Jesus. He didn't have a seeing problem. I believe that Peter was with Jesus when Jesus was talking to them out there on the boat, and Jesus says, why don't you launch out? Why don't you launch out into the deep? And Peter says, well, I heard we have fished all night. We have caught nothing. However, nevertheless, at your word, we'll let down the net. They cast the net, and there was a whole bunch of fish. I don't think Peter had a seeing problem. I believe that Peter was with Jesus when the tax collector named Matthew came up, and Matthew was known as a thief, and Matthew was known as a crook. I believe Peter was right there when Jesus looked at him, and Jesus says, come on, Matthew, I know your life. I know all that you've been doing. Come on and follow me. Peter was right there. Peter didn't have a seeing problem. Peter was right there when Jesus went to the house, and Peter's mother-in-law was ill. She had a fever. And Jesus healed his mother-in-law. And most theologians will tell you that's why Peter denied Christ. Not really. I don't think Peter had a seeing problem. Peter saw all that Jesus was doing. He saw the miracles. He knew that Jesus could do all things. Peter did not have a seeing problem. But here in this instance, Jesus looks at Peter and says, Peter, do you see that woman? What did that question really mean? Do you see? Do you see that woman? I believe that Jesus said to Peter, do you see that woman? Because Peter had a seeing problem, like most of us. Over in Mark's Gospel, in chapter 8, there's a great miracle. When you get home, read that story. There's an interesting story where it's the only time when Jesus messed up in working a miracle. So they thought. Because Jesus performed a miracle on the man that was blind. And when Jesus performed the miracle, the man thought Jesus was finished. And Jesus looked at him and Jesus says, could you see? He said, yeah, I can see, but all them people look like trees to me. I ain't really seeing. All that means is that Jesus, I know you gave me my sight, but you didn't finish the miracle. And Jesus performed that, and Jesus says, you can see now. And he says, yeah, I'm seeing, but I don't know. I'm looking out there, and all those people look like trees. And Jesus says, no, I gotta touch you again. And Jesus touched him again. And then he says, oh, I can see clearly now. So it is with people in the church. Sometimes we can see, but we rarely can't see. And that's why Jesus said to Peter, do you see that woman? Do you really see that woman? I know you've been looking at her. You saw when she came in here, and you saw her wiping my feet, and you saw all of this, but do you really see that woman? I believe Jesus had something in mind when he said, do you see that woman? I'm reminded of this woman named Edith. Edith was in college, and Edith was healthily overweight. Nobody wanted to date Edith. As a matter of fact, everybody referred to Edith as Big E. 20 years old, but everybody referred to her, you know, Big E. And everybody laughed at Big E, and they would have their dances, and nobody wanted to go anywhere with Big E. Nobody was whispering to her sweet little nothings in her ear. None of the guys were winking. Nobody was whistling at her. Georgina was great. She passed by the office today, and I whistled. And she refused to look back. She wouldn't even look back. That's good. I was just making sure you understand what kind of man we have in church. But Big E, everybody called her Big E until the summer came. And when summer came, Big E disappeared. Nobody knew where Big E went. But when school resumed, there was Edith. Nobody called her Big E no more. But she came into school, and now all the guys were whistling. All the guys wanted to date. All the guys were looking at her, and all the guys were sending her little notes because she was no longer Big E. She was something to behold. And she said to a friend, all of those people who are trying to date me right now, they don't want to date me because who I really am. But this is me. I've always been this person. They just never saw this person. But this was always bottled up inside of me. But they didn't see that, and it is the same problem we have in the church. We don't really see people for who they really are. But God would say to all of us, do you see that woman? Do you really? So here are some reasons that I think Jesus was saying to Peter, Peter, do you see that woman? Because I believe Peter joined in with the crowd, and all of them were saying, that's a prostitute. She's playing with your feet. That's a prostitute. And Jesus said, do you really see her? Because in church, we have a seeing problem. We have an eye problem in church. We are just like Moses and the 10 spies. And we are just like those spies because 2 of them came back with a good report. 2 of them came back and Moses says, what did you see? And they says, most of them says, man, we can't go in there. What did you see? We saw, man, we like grasshoppers. We can't go in there. But two of them, Joshua and Caleb, says, I don't care what they saw when they went in, but let me tell you what we saw. And then they pulled out the grapes. And then they said, man, look at this, man, we are. And they says, we are well able to overcome because we know the God that we serve. 10 of them. And in the church, it's the same thing. I don't know what we see sometimes, what we see in people, what we should not be seeing in people, and we condemn people because we are seeing the wrong things. There's another reason why Jesus says, Peter, do you see that woman? And I believe it's this. We are blind to what is most important because we are distracted by things that are not really important. And all they were seeing, oh, she's a prostitute. That's not what Jesus was seeing. Jesus was seeing beyond the practice of prostitution. Jesus was seeing beyond that. And Jesus was saying, Peter, what you're reminding me of this woman is not who she really is. And Jesus is saying, do you see her? She didn't get anybody's permission to come in there. But there she was. She didn't belong in the inner circle. But there she was. And Jesus, do you see her? What do you see when you see her? As somebody who didn't get permission to come in here? Oh, we do it in church all the time. We see people come in church, and what do we really see when we see people? We see problems. She is a problem. That's what we see when we come in church, or when people come in church, when people come in the front door, we see a whole bunch of problems. God help us. What do you see? I pray that God would bring us to the place where we see possibilities rather than problems. I saw in camp this week a lot of doctors and a lot of lawyers and a lot of engineers. That's what I saw. I saw in camp this week a lot of pastors. I saw in our little children, I saw this week, I just saw, and I can envision 20 years from now, look at them, and I can remember camp this week. Ornery, disrespectful, don't care, in your face. But God help us that we can look beyond that, that we must have more than sight. We must have vision. That's why Jesus says, do you see this woman? And I saw our children this week, and by gosh, we didn't have to put any one of them out of camp. Did we almost? Joshua was there one day, we almost. We didn't have to put anybody out of camp. That doesn't mean that we didn't almost. Marie had 2 kids here. But when you look beyond the ordinary, when you look beyond and you see the potential in all of these kids, we hear the words of Jesus to Peter, do you see this child? And when that happens, we move beyond the pain and the heartaches we get from these children. And we see the great possibilities of what Jesus will do and what he has done for all of us. Thirdly, we in the church are blind because we can't see the work of God when the evidence is standing right in front of us. And that's why Jesus gave that little story, and Jesus says, these two people, Jesus was saying, you don't know where that woman came from, and she has been forgiven. You don't even understand that it was just last week she was a prostitute. You just don't understand that it was just last week she was selling her body. But here she is, praising me. Here she is, lavishing this ointment on my feet, and all the other folks can talk about is the fact what she used to do last week. Boy, I was preparing a sermon and I almost prayed, Lord, could you send us a whole lot of prostitutes in here? Just to see what we would do and hear people talking about, oh, she come to take my man. That's what we'd be talking about. Do you see her? That's when the drug addict comes in here. Do you see him? But more than anything else, Jesus was saying to Peter, Peter, she has been touched by grace, the same grace by which you yourself have been touched. That's why I'm asking you, do you see her? Because some of us think we have been touched by special grace. No, we've been touched by the same grace. Oh, man. Do you see her? Do you see her? Touched by the same grace that I've been touched by and with? That you mean Jesus touched me because, I'm special. 70 years ago, God delivered me. I'm special, very special. And I've been blessed through the years. I shouldn't even be here. But God was gracious to me. And boy, as good as God has been to me. And every now and then I meet somebody and I realize, man, gosh, God has touched them with the same grace that God has touched me with. I saw a young man in Trinidad who left the church for 8 years. Was a great pastor in Trinidad and left the church for 8 years. And his wife stayed beside him. Just about 3 months ago, he got back to the Lord through another denomination. And I was with his mother, and I said to his mother, what I hate most is that he is back. But why didn't he come back with us? Why did he go with the open Bible? Why did he go somewhere else? He spent 8 years out there, messed around with alcohol, messed around with drugs, and now he's back preaching the gospel. And she said because the Nazarenes, while he was out there, all of them condemned him. All of them said he was a no good, from the district superintendent down. All the pastors had nothing to do with him for 8 years, but talk about him. And it's people from the open Bible that every now and then would give him a kind word. And now that God had broken into him, and now that God has brought him back, he didn't come back to the Nazarenes, but he went somewhere else. Because all the Nazarenes forgot that they had been touched with the same grace that everybody else has been touched with. And it should humble all of us to understand that grace does not discriminate. That's why Jesus says, do you see her? She has been touched by the same grace. Peter, you no good. You've been touched by the same grace. Do you see? Peter says, Jesus says, do you see that woman? Because Jesus was saying that we are blind to our own navel-gazing self-righteousness. That a very simple definition we had when I got saved way back then. I entered Bible college. The first thing we learned in terms of a definition of grace, that grace is the unmerited favor of God. Might be a primitive definition, but it's that I got a hold of this very early. That grace is that application of God in our lives that we don't really deserve and we didn't work for. How we can show off with something that we didn't work for. Oh my God, grace touched us and we didn't deserve it, but grace touched us. And Jesus is saying to Peter, do you see that woman? She's touched by that grace. I believe that there are folks who don't want to have anything to do with Christianity because we don't see. I had gone to Community of Hope to become the pastor, but I could never forget. I started doing ministry as the pastor of that church at a home with some women who had lost their children, because some of them because of drug abuse, some of them because, circumstances beyond their control, but they had all lost their children, and 26 of them were living in a home. And I started a ministry there. And once a month, I worked out contractually where once a month they will come to church. And it so happened that they came to our church the same weekend that the government allowed them to have their children. And when that bus pulled up and I saw all these women coming to church, I was glad at first, and then I looked behind and I saw a long trail. 25 children coming to church. Children who were in an orphan home, children who had no discipline whatsoever. Children, I was working on the mothers. I was trying to get the mothers in church, but it so happened that these mothers had children, and they would only get the children once a month. And as God would have it, it would be the same Sunday that those mothers decided to come to my church. And I heard some of the women saying, Pastor, what are you going to do about the children? And I said, what are you going to do about these children? And the treasurer of my church looked at me and she says, I don't like children. And I said, I don't like you either. And she says, I'm leaving this church until you do something with those children. And when you do something with these children, then you can call me and I'll come back to church. And I said, to hell with you. Because God was getting ready to do something in the lives of these children. It so happened that they have, in the lives of these mothers, it so happened that they have children. And the same God and the same grace that have been praying to God, apply grace in the lives of these mothers, is the same God who is able to apply grace in the lives of these little children. And I said, you can go. She never came back. But it's out of these children that today we have lawyers and we have doctors. Out of these same children that were coming all through the country, touched by God's grace. Do you see this woman? Do you see this child? I got a call one day from one of the offices in Washington, D.C. And a young lady called me and she said, "Are you Oliver Phillips?" I said, "Yeah, I am." She says, "You the pastor of the church now?" "Yeah." Tommy, she's the pastor. I said, "Yeah." She says, "I have a whole lot of stuff. I work in an office and I have a whole lot of stuff. I need to give it away. And could I give it to you? And I said, "Sure." I didn't know what it was. And I got down there as quickly as I could, and she told me the story. She says, "You know, I was one of the women staying in one of your apartments. And you know what? Now I'm working in a government office downtown. And I'm not only working in the government office, but I'm the supervisor here. And we have a whole, and those were the days of fax machines. And she says, we have a whole lot of fax machines that the government, we are getting rid of some 12 fax machines. But I is the supervisor here. I make the decision who gets these fax machines." And I thought of this place that I stayed in some years ago. And that's why I'm calling. She said, "I remember you. You had just gotten there." But she said, "I'm the supervisor down here. I'm the big honcho. I make the call. And I just wanted to give you 12 fax machines. Touched by the same grace that touched me." Do you see that woman? Do you see her? Do you see that man? Oh, Jesus, I wish he would ask us the same question. Do you see that person who has just joined this church? Do you see that person who wants to join this church? Do you see that person who wants to be a part of this church? What do you see? Sight is not vision. Oh God, give us more than sight. Give us vision. We would be a different people. Who are these women today? Do you see her? Who is that woman in your life that Jesus would say, "Do you see that woman?" God bring us to the place where we don't see problems, but we see possibilities. Because that's what God saw in all of us. To make a difference in one life. Do you see that? You know the story of the starfish. And it's this one 8-year-old guy on the seashore. And the storm had passed. And all the starfish had washed up on the shore. And this young 8-year-old boy is taking all the starfish one by one as they wash up. And he's taking them and he's rescuing them by throwing them back into the water. Until this old sage came by and said, "Boy, what are you doing?" He says, "I'm throwing the starfish." And the old sage said, "You don't think that you will make a difference? There are thousands of starfish washed up on this shore. You think you can make a difference by throwing these?" And he says, "Yes, I can make a difference with this one starfish that I can throw back." Do you see that starfish? Not the rest that wouldn't make it, but that one. That's what God calls of us. Do you see that one? That you can make a difference in that one life. Because somebody is looking at you And you are the only Bible that somebody will read. There is somebody that will never read a Bible, but you are the only Bible that they will ever read. What are you going to have them read? Do you see that woman? Father, we thank you that you have called on all of us to be disciples, but we mess up so often. And we seem to hear the words of Jesus to us today. Do you see that woman? Do you see that young child? Do you see that man? Could you see that that person is touched by the same grace that has touched you? Oh God, humble us. Open our eyes that we might see beyond the problems, beyond the obvious challenges. Open our eyes that we may see the possibilities of what God can do in every life that comes through this church. So precious. So precious. And we thank you. Open our eyes today, Lord. Open our eyes that we might have that vision of tomorrow, not just today. Do you see that woman?